Professor Quarks's Brightscale adjusted his ceremonial academic robe, taking special care to ensure all 6 of his arms were properly positioned through the sleeves. The iridescent fabric shimmered under the soft glow of the quantum lights in his private office at the Galactic University's Department of Xenomythology. Another day, another chance to enlighten young minds about the absurdity of ancient galactic legends, he muttered to himself, checking his reflection in the polished durasteel wall. His scales gleamed a perfect shade of azure, exactly what one would expect from the youngest tenured professor in the university's 12,000-year history. The chronometer chimed pleasantly, indicating it was time for his favorite class, Mythological Species 401 Humans Facts vs. Fiction. He gathered his teaching materials, including his prized collection of supposedly authentic human artifacts, all obvious forgeries, of course, and made his way to Lecture Hall 7. The corridors of the university buzzed with activity. Students from across the galaxy hurried to their classes, some floating, others crawling, a few rolling, and many walking on various numbers of appendages. Professor Brightscale nodded graciously to several colleagues as he passed, including Professor Luminara from Quantum Poetry Studies, who was currently teaching a fascinating course on the relationship between particle physics and haikus. As he entered the lecture hall, the familiar sight of his diverse student body greeted him. In the front row, young Squishella, a gelatinous mass of transparent protoplasm, wobbled excitedly. Behind her, Razorback, a crystalline entity from the silicon-based life sector, refracted light in complex patterns, their species' way of showing enthusiasm. "Good morning, class," Professor Brightscale announced, using all 6 arms to arrange his materials on the hovering podium. "Or good evening for those of you from nocturnal worlds. And good middle phase for our friends from the quantum realm who experience time non-linearly." A chorus of greetings in various frequencies, chemical signals, and telepathic pulses responded. Professor Brightscale smiled, revealing his perfectly maintained ceremonial fangs, another mark of his prestigious position. "Today we continue our fascinating exploration of one of the galaxy's most persistent myths, humans," he pronounced the word with scholarly disdain. "These supposedly bipedal beings from the legendary planet Earth have captured the imagination of countless species for millennia. But as we'll discuss today, the very features that make them so captivating also prove their fictional nature." He activated the holographic display, projecting a series of images showing alleged human achievements. Note the obvious artistic exaggerations in these ancient documents. The idea that any species could survive with only 2 eyes, no backup organs, and skin so thin you can see through it. Preposterous. From the middle of the classroom, TZZs, a hive mind colony of microscopic organisms arranged in the shape of a traditional university chair, raised their collective consciousness to ask a question. "Professor, what about the recent reports from the Outer Rim?" "Ah, yes," Professor Brightscale waved 3 of his arms dismissively while using the other 3 to pull up more historical data. "The supposed human outpost discoveries. Clearly another case of overeager junior researchers misidentifying ruins. Really, the notion that a species could achieve spaceflight while still requiring regular periods of unconsciousness is simply absurd." The class dutifully took notes, their various appendages, psychic notepads, and biological recording organs capturing every word of his lecture. Professor Brightscale felt that familiar surge of satisfaction. Here he was, doing his part to dispel dangerous superstitions and replace them with solid, scientific fact. Little did he know, this would be his last normal lecture on human mythology. In fact, this would be his last normal anything for quite some time. Professor Brightscale activated the next holographic display, showing what purported to be a human performing something called a marathon. The entire class burst into various species-appropriate expressions of amusement. Even the normally stoic gas cloud twins, Nebula and Nova, rippled with mirth. Yes, quite ridiculous indeed," Professor Brightscale chuckled, his scales shifting to a lighter shade of blue with amusement. "The ancient texts claim that humans would regularly run approximately 42 kilometers for entertainment." He paused for dramatic effect, without even being chased by predators. Squishella raised a pseudopod. "But Professor, wouldn't their exoskeletons crack under such stress?" An excellent observation. And that brings us to perhaps the most outlandish claim of all: humans allegedly had no exoskeleton. The myths described them as having an endoskeleton covered only by a thin layer of cells they called skin. The entire class collectively expressed their disbelief through a cacophony of squeaks, bubbles, light pulses, and telepathic gasps. Furthermore, the professor continued, thoroughly enjoying himself, they supposedly had no backup organs, just one heart, one set of lungs, and get this, only 2 eyes. Surely that's a translation error, chirped Razorback, their crystalline form vibrating with skepticism. Even the most primitive species have at least 6 eyes. One would think so, Professor Brightscale agreed, pulling up another hologram. But all alleged human artifacts show the same bizarre configuration. 2 forward-facing eyes, 2 pathetically small audio sensors they called ears, and a single breathing apparatus they termed a nose. TZ's hive mind buzzed with confusion. How did they detect predators approaching from behind? They didn't. According to the myths, they had to physically turn their entire bodies around. Can you imagine? A supposedly spacefaring species that couldn't even see in 360 degrees. The class frantically recorded these absurdities. Professor Brightscale noticed several students had activated their secondary and tertiary brains to handle the overwhelming amount of illogical information. But wait, it gets better. He projected a new image. Humans supposedly spent 1/3 of their lives in a state of unconsciousness called sleep. They would become completely vulnerable for hours at a time, lying horizontally with their eyes closed. Professor interrupted Photonia, a being of pure light who had to wear a containment suit to attend class. Are you suggesting they voluntarily became comatose every day? Precisely. And here's the truly preposterous part, they claimed this state was necessary for their survival. A species that regularly renders itself helpless, achieving space travel. Pure fantasy. Professor Brightscale moved on to his favorite part of the lecture. Now let's discuss their claimed environmental adaptations. According to legend, humans could survive in temperature ranges from 258 to 310 degrees Kelvin without any genetic modifications or protective equipment. They could allegedly process multiple types of organic matter for energy, including substances that would be toxic to most species. That's thermodynamically impossible, protested Nova, their gaseous form swirling with indignation. Exactly. And yet the myths persist. They even claim humans could repair broken bones, yes, their internal calcium-based support structures without medical intervention, just by continuing their normal functions. The professor pulled up his pride and joy, a holographic representation of supposed human physical capabilities. Look at these numbers. They claim humans could generate enough force to lift several times their own body weight, that they could continue moving for hours after sustaining injuries that would kill most species, that they could survive the loss of entire limbs through a process they called healing. Squishella had turned an alarming shade of green. Professor, I feel nauseous just thinking about such biological impossibilities. A perfectly reasonable reaction. The very concept violates at least 7 fundamental laws of xenobiology, and we haven't even touched on their most outrageous claimed ability, their supposed capacity for ingesting nearly any organic compound and somehow surviving the experience. The class was so engaged that nobody noticed the unusual commotion in the hallway outside. Nobody paid attention to the increasingly urgent messages popping up on the university's communication system. And absolutely nobody, least of all Professor Brightscale, noticed the group of tall, bipedal figures being escorted toward Lecture Hall 7 by the university dean herself. Professor Brightscale was in his element, gesturing with all 6 arms as he prepared to reveal his crowning piece of evidence against human existence. And now, class, prepare yourselves for the most absurd claim of all. These mythical humans supposedly had the ability to. The lecture hall doors swung open with a dramatic whoosh. The university dean, Ambassador Xelixia, glided in on her anti-gravity platform. Her bioluminescent antennae were pulsing with an unusual shade of excitement. Professor Brightscale, my sincerest apologies for interrupting your lecture, but we have some rather significant guests. Behind her walked on 2 legs 5 tall figures. The entire class went silent. Even the quantum probability students, who existed in multiple states simultaneously, condensed into single shocked expressions. The tallest of the bipedal beings stepped forward. Ambassador Rebecca Sullivan, representing the United Earth Federation, she smiled, displaying a row of flat teeth that somehow seemed more terrifying than any predatory fangs. "We heard this was a class about human mythology. Hope you don't mind if we audit." Professor Brightscale's scales shifted through 7 different colors before settling on a sickly pale green. His primary heart stopped. Thankfully, his backup hearts kept him functioning. "You but." "Oh, please, continue." Another human stepped forward, this one wearing what appeared to be some kind of uniform. "Commander James Thompson, UF Military Liaison. I'm particularly interested in hearing about these absurd claims regarding human endurance." The professor's teaching materials slipped from his suddenly numb hands, all 6 of them. The holographic display still showed his carefully prepared presentation titled, "Why Humans Cannot Possibly Exist, a Scientific Analysis." Squishella, bless her protoplasmic heart, raised a pseudopod. "Excuse me, are you saying you're actually real?" Ambassador Sullivan laughed, a sound that sent shivers through every species in the room capable of experiencing shivers. "Last time I checked, though I have to admit, that existential philosophy course I took in college did raise some interesting questions." But Professor Brightscale finally found his voice, even if it was several octaves higher than usual. The environmental adaptations, the lack of backup organs, the need for sleep, it's all scientifically impossible. Commander Thompson grinned and pulled out a small object from his pocket. Several students recoiled in terror as he bit into it with an audible crunch. "Anyone want some of my apple? Single origin, grown on Earth, completely safe for human consumption, though I should warn others it might contain compounds your species would consider toxic." The third human, a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Blackwood, approached the holographic display. "Oh, this is fascinating. You've actually underestimated our lifting capabilities by about 20%. Would you like me to update your data?" Professor Brightscale watched in horror as she casually began correcting his life's work. His third backup heart was starting to flutter dangerously. "And this section about our healing abilities," the fourth human, Medical Officer Patricia Martinez, pointed out. "It's quite accurate that we can survive the loss of limbs, but you've missed some interesting details about our cellular regeneration capabilities." The fifth human, Cultural Attaché Michael Okonjo, was busy answering a rapid-fire series of questions from the increasingly excited students. "Yes, we really do sleep. No, we don't consider it particularly dangerous. Yes, we can see behind us, we just turn our heads. No, we don't miss having extra arms, though I must admit Professor Brightscale's dexterity is impressive." But the historical records, Professor Brightscale waved his arms frantically at his collection of artifacts. "These are all clearly forgeries." Ambassador Sullivan peered at the display case. "Actually, that's a genuine 21st century iPhone. Though I should mention it's being displayed upside down." The professor slumped into his hover chair, all 4 legs buckling beneath him. His prized collection, his published papers, his entire academic career, all built on the premise that humans were mythological creatures. And now here they were, casually eating apples and correcting his research notes. "That reminds me," Commander Thompson said, finishing his apple and casually tossing the core into a recycling unit 20 meters away without looking. "We're here to discuss Earth joining the Galactic University Exchange Program. Would anyone be interested in studying on Earth?" The classroom erupted into chaos. Students began shouting questions all at once. "Is it true humans drink dihydrogen monoxide to survive? Can you really repair broken bones just by waiting? Do you actually continue moving after injury just by ignoring pain? What's sleep like? Why only 2 eyes? How do you survive with such thin skin?" Ambassador Sullivan raised her hands for quiet, and to the professor's further shock, the class actually fell silent. "We'll be happy to answer all your questions." In fact, she turned to Dean Exelixia with another one of those terrifying smiles. "Perhaps we could arrange some practical demonstrations." Professor Brightscale's fourth and final backup heart gave an ominous lurch. "Practical demonstrations?" He looked at his carefully crafted syllabus, then at the 5 impossible beings standing in his classroom, then back at his syllabus. I suppose he said weakly. This means I'll need to update the course title from Mythological Species 401 to something else. Don't worry, Professor Dr. Blackwood said cheerfully. Think of all the exciting new research opportunities. By the way, we brought some videos of human extreme sports. Would you like to see them now, or should we wait until you've recovered from your current shock? The professor's last backup heart made its decision for him as he gracefully passed out, his scales cycling through the entire visible spectrum before settling on a profound and deeply embarrassed purple. Professor Brightscale regained consciousness to find himself propped up in his hover chair, surrounded by concerned faces, both alien and the impossibly real human ones. Dr. Martinez was checking his vital signs with a curious handheld device. Fascinating cardiovascular system, she remarked. All 5 hearts appear to be functioning normally now, though I must say, having backup organs does seem rather practical. Perhaps we humans are the weird ones for getting by with just one of everything. The professor blinked all 4 pairs of eyes. Please tell me I was hallucinating. Afraid not, Commander Thompson grinned. But since you're awake, how about those practical demonstrations we mentioned? The entire class had relocated to the university's massive xenobiology gymnasium. Dean Zelixia had enthusiastically approved the impromptu field trip, much to Professor Brightscale's mounting distress. First up, Ambassador Sullivan announced, "Let's address the endurance claim she had changed into something called workout clothes, which seemed terrifyingly flimsy to the watching aliens." The ambassador stepped onto a treadmill designed for testing various species' movement capabilities. "Standard Earth gravity, please." "But that's nearly twice the universal standard," Professor Brightscale protested. Sullivan started jogging, then running, then sprinting. 10 minutes passed, 20, 30. She wasn't even breathing particularly hard. "This is actually my normal morning routine," she explained while running. "Though usually I prefer running outdoors. Anyone want to join me?" Several brave students tried. Most lasted less than a minute before retreating, thoroughly impressed and mildly traumatized. "Now, about that strength demonstration," Commander Thompson said, approaching the weightlifting area. The entire class watched in horror as he began lifting weights that were clearly labeled for high-gravity species. "Notice how humans can temporarily exceed their normal strength limits in emergency situations," Dr. Blackwood explained, recording data. "The process releases chemicals called adrenaline and noradrenaline, allowing for rather remarkable feats." But the strain on their endoskeleton," Professor Brightscale sputtered. "Oh right, the bones." Medical Officer Martinez pulled up some medical scans. "See these hairline fractures? Watch what happens over just a few weeks." The scans showed bones knitting themselves back together. Several students had to activate their emergency stabilization protocols to avoid fainting. And now Cultural Attaché Okonjo announced the eating demonstration. He proceeded to consume items that made the entire xenobiology department question their understanding of digestive systems. Sweet, sour, spicy, bitter, the human showed no signs of distress. "Here's a fun fact," Okonjo said between bites. "Some humans actively seek out foods containing capsaicin, a compound that triggers pain receptors for entertainment." For entertainment, Professor Brightscale felt his scales beginning to fade again. "Oh yes, and wait until you hear about our tolerance for caffeine, a neurotoxin we regularly consume for pleasure." Squishella, who had been bouncing excitedly through all the demonstrations, raised a pseudopod. "What about the sleep thing? Can we see that?" "That might take a while," Ambassador Sullivan laughed. "But we did bring brain scan data showing neural activity during various sleep cycles." The professor watched in growing resignation as his students crowded around the humans, asking increasingly detailed questions. Razorback was particularly interested in the concept of human sports, especially after Commander Thompson showed videos of something called parkour. Question TZ's hive mind buzzed. The historical records mention humans would continue fighting even after sustaining significant damage. How is this possible without a distributed nervous system? "Ah, you mean like this?" Commander Thompson rolled up his sleeve to reveal several scars. "Broke this arm in 3 places during a training exercise. Kept going for another hour before seeking medical attention." The entire class stared in a mixture of horror and awe. Professor Brightscale made a small whimpering noise. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of human capability, Dr. Blackwood added, is our adaptability. We can survive in almost any environment with minimal technological assistance. Here's data from our colonies on worlds ranging from 0.3 to 2.1 standard gravity. Professor Photonia's light patterns showed concern. Are you all right? Your scales are doing that color cycling thing again. Professor Brightscale realized he had been sitting in stunned silence for several minutes. His entire understanding of xenobiology, decades of research, countless published papers, all undone in a single afternoon by 5 humans who seemed to be enjoying themselves far too much. I suppose this means my upcoming book, The Logical Impossibility of Human Existence, will need some minor revisions, he managed weakly. Oh, don't worry about that, Ambassador Sullivan said cheerfully. We'd be happy to help you revise it. In fact, we're inviting xenobiologists to Earth for extended research opportunities. Would you be interested in studying actual human communities? The professor looked at his students, who were now excitedly discussing potential Earth exchange programs. He looked at his carefully crafted lecture notes, now thoroughly annotated with corrections by the humans. He looked at the medical scans showing biological capabilities that defied everything he thought he knew about physics and evolution. I would like that very much, he said finally. Though perhaps we should start with basic safety protocols. How do you avoid accidentally crushing things with your apparently ridiculous grip strength? That's the spirit, Commander Thompson clapped him on the shoulder, causing all 5 of his hearts to skip a beat. Just wait until we tell you about human medical practices. Ever heard of something called acupuncture? The next few hours in the xenobiology gymnasium turned into what the humans called a show and tell session. Professor Brightscale found himself taking notes with all 6 arms, his academic curiosity finally overcoming his professional embarrassment. So you're saying, he clarified, watching Ambassador Sullivan demonstrate something called yoga, that humans deliberately contort themselves into these positions for relaxation. An exercise, Sullivan responded while somehow balancing her entire body on just her hands. This particular pose is called a handstand. Pretty basic stuff, really. The professor's note-taking intensified. Basic? Basic? You're supporting your entire body weight on your smallest limbs, without any anti-gravity assistance. Nearby, Commander Thompson was explaining the concept of martial arts to an enthralled group of students. Sometimes we practice fighting techniques just for fun or exercise, he explained, moving through a series of fluid motions that made the professor seriously question his understanding of bipedal balance. But how do you avoid serious injury? Razorback asked, their crystalline form vibrating with curiosity. Oh, we do get injured, Thompson grinned. That's half the fun. Check this out, he pulled up his shirt to reveal more scars. This one's from a sparring match, this is from rock climbing, and this one actually that's from trying to cook breakfast. You deliberately practice combat while injured and consider it entertainment. Professor Brightscale felt his scales starting to shift colors again. Professor Dr. Blackwood called out excitedly. Come look at these cellular regeneration rates. Your paper on the theoretical limits of biological repair mechanisms needs some major updates. The professor hovered over to the research station, where his carefully documented theories were being cheerfully demolished by actual data. To his own surprise, he found himself suggesting revisions and asking increasingly specific questions. Fascinating. So the mechanical stress actually promotes bone density increase, and you say children's bones heal even faster. Speaking of children, Medical Officer Martinez added, wait until you hear about human pregnancy. The way the female body completely rearranges internal organs to accommodate fetal development is quite remarkable. Several students who had been considering xenobiology specializations in human studies suddenly decided to explore other options. Cultural attaché Konjo had set up what he called a snack table, displaying various human foods. The professor watched in horrified fascination as his students cautiously sampled human-safe versions of Earth cuisine. This substance, Squishella wobbled excitedly, you call it chocolate. And it's not classified as a controlled substance. Nope. Though some people do say it's addictive, Okonjo laughed. Wait until you try coffee. Professor Tiz's hive mind buzzed thoughtfully. Given this new evidence, perhaps your next paper could focus on how humans have been misclassified as impossible, rather than just highly improbable. Professor Brightscale found himself nodding enthusiastically. Yes, exactly. And we'll need to completely revise our understanding of evolutionary constraints. Ambassador Sullivan, you mentioned something about human settlements in variable gravity environments. Already sending you the data, Sullivan smiled. Though you might want to sit down for the section about extreme sports. Have you heard of something called base jumping? The next hour was filled with videos that made the professor grateful for his multiple hearts. Humans throwing themselves off cliffs with minimal safety equipment. Humans diving into ocean trenches. Humans climbing frozen waterfalls. Humans running through fires. All, apparently, for recreation. But why, he finally managed to ask. Because it's fun, all 5 humans answered in unison. Sometimes, Commander Thompson added, because it's there. That's not a logical reason, the professor protested. Welcome to studying humans, Dr. Blackwood patted him sympathetically with her terrifyingly strong grip. We're doing things because they're fun, challenging, or just because no one else has done them, yet are perfectly valid motivations. The professor looked around his gymnasium-turned-classroom. Squishella was attempting to learn human dance moves with predictably gelatinous results. Razorback was comparing crystalline growth patterns to human nail and hair growth. The gas cloud twins were trying to understand the concept of human swimming. His students were learning. They were excited. They were engaged. And he had to admit, so was he. Very well, he announced, straightening his academic robes. I propose we transform this class into an actual xenobiology course on human capabilities. With practical demonstrations, he shuddered slightly at the last part. Excellent idea, Ambassador Sullivan beamed. In fact, we're setting up a student exchange program. How would your class like to visit Earth? The resulting excitement nearly overloaded the gymnasium's emotion-dampening fields. 1 week later, Professor Brightscale stood before the Galactic University's academic board, all 6 arms clutching various data pads and research materials. His scales had finally settled into a confident shade of blue again, though they still occasionally flickered with embarrassed purple when he thought about his previous lectures. Distinguished colleagues, he began, I come before you today to propose a complete overhaul of our xenobiology curriculum, particularly regarding human studies. As recent events have made abundantly clear, my previous research contained certain oversights. In the audience, Ambassador Sullivan and her team gave encouraging thumbs up, a human gesture the professor had learned meant approval rather than a threat display. First, he activated his holopresentation. I suggest renaming Mythological Species 401 to Applied Human Studies, a practical guide to improbable biology, with regular guest lectures from actual humans, of course. Dean Xelixia's antennae glowed approvingly. And the practical demonstrations you mentioned. Yes, well, the professor's scales rippled slightly. Commander Thompson has offered to show our advanced students something called parkour, though I insist we triple the padding in the gymnasium first, and perhaps install some additional gravity dampeners. I've also reviewed Professor Brightscale's revised research papers, Dr. Blackwood added, standing up. His new theory on how humans violate the laws of biology just enough to be interesting, but not enough to break reality completely, is quite innovative. The professor brought up his next slide. Furthermore, I propose a new classification system for human capabilities. Instead of dismissing them as impossible, we should perhaps categorize them as improbably probable. Speaking of probabilities, interrupted a quantum physics professor. How do you explain their apparent ability to succeed despite astronomical odds? Ah, yes, the humans call that determination. Or sometimes spite. I'm still researching the distinction. The board members murmured among themselves, occasionally glancing at the 5 humans who had turned the university's understanding of biology upside down in just a week. There's also the matter of my previous publications, the professor continued. I've prepared comprehensive corrections for my books, The Logical Impossibility of Human Existence, Myths and Legends Why Humans Can't Be Real, and Bipedal Paradox, A Scientific Refutation of Human Biology. The new editions, Ambassador Sullivan added cheerfully, will include actual human medical data. though we suggest adding a warning label to the chapter about our healing capabilities. We've had 3 faculty members faint already. Professor Brightscale nodded enthusiastically. Yes, and wait until you see the data on human children. Did you know they regularly survive falls that would incapacitate adults of most species? And they do this while their bones are still developing. Perhaps we should save that for the advanced courses, Dean Exalixia suggested gently, noting several board members looking distinctly queasy. Of course. Though we should definitely include the section about human pack bonding behaviors. Did you know they adopt other species as family members? They call them pets. We have an entire research team trying to understand how they form emotional attachments to non-sentient creatures. Commander Thompson raised his hand. Don't forget to mention the space program. Particularly the early years when we basically strapped ourselves to controlled explosions because we really wanted to see what was up there. Several board members required immediate medical attention. Which brings me to my final point, the professor said, his scales now glowing with genuine excitement. I propose we establish a permanent human studies department with real humans. Think of the research possibilities, the things we could learn, the papers we could publish. As long as you remember to verify your facts, this time Ambassador Sullivan teased. Yes, of course, the professor waved all 6 arms dismissively. Though in my defense, the truth about humans is far more improbable than anything I could have theorized. Did you know they drink dihydrogen monoxide for fun? And sometimes they add bubbles to it. The academic board's deliberation was interrupted by excited shouting from outside. Through the windows, they could see a group of students attempting to learn human dancing in the courtyard. Squishella had actually managed a fairly decent moonwalk, though the concept of up and down was still a bit fuzzy for a gelatinous being. Very well, Dean Exalixia announced. Proposal accepted. Though please ensure all human demonstrations include appropriate safety measures. We're still repairing the quantum probability field after Commander Thompson showed the physics department something called a backflip. Wonderful, Professor Brightscale beamed. Now, about next semester's curriculum. Ambassador Sullivan has agreed to teach a course on human sports and recreation activities, though we may need to update the university's insurance policies first. As the meeting concluded, Professor Brightscale found himself already planning future lectures. True, his previous research was now better suited as comedy material than scientific literature. And yes, he would never live down the video of him fainting when the humans first arrived. But none of that mattered. He had an entirely new field of study to explore, filled with impossible beings who did impossible things for impossible reasons. And somehow, that made perfect sense. Professor Ambassador Sullivan approached with that now familiar terrifying smile. Ready to start working on your new book? We thought we could call it Humans Breaking the Laws of Biology Since 300,000 BCE. Excellent title. Though perhaps we should add a subtitle. Something like a practical guide to improbable evolution. Perfect. And for the cover image, we have some great shots of human extreme ironing competitions. Professor Brightscale's scales cycled through several colors before settling on a confused orange. Extreme ironing. Oh yes, it's when humans combine doing household chores with extreme sports, like ironing clothes while skydiving. The professor's scales went completely transparent. I think we should save that for the advanced curriculum. And somewhere in the vast expanse of space, the concept of logic threw up its metaphorical hands and went on vacation.